Hey everyone, this is Brian Kelly from Association Mavens, where you get direct access to some of the foremost thinkers and teachers in the association industry. My guest today is Mary Byers. Mary is a national speaker, author, and consultant, as well as an award-winning communicator who's been speaking professionally since 1988. She currently consults with a wide variety of associations, corporations, and civic groups, specializing in the facilitation of tough conversations. Welcome to Association Mavens, Mary.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you.
So to get started with our interview here, I wanted to give you a question that I thought about as I was going through preparation for the interview. And it's really, I want to focus on the Race for Relevance book. And I wondered, is this your first book or have you written others?
Race for Relevance is actually not my first book. I have written a total of 6, including Race for Relevance. Race for Relevance, however, is the first one that I wrote in the field of association management, and it became a reality when I was approached by my co-author, Harrison Kerber, about putting some of what we were seeing as strategic planning facilitators onto the written page. So that's how the book came about.
Excellent. So that kind of leads me into the next question is, how and when did you guys identify the 6 challenges that are outlined in the book Race for Relevance?
It was interesting, Brian. It didn't matter what group we were working with, whether it was veterinary medicine, real estate, new car and truck dealers, mechanical engineers, dentistry, physicians. All associations are struggling. And as we were listening to what they were struggling with in the retreats that we were facilitating, we kept seeing patterns. It would be the same types of issues coming up. And from that, we were able to identify the list of 6 challenges and there then move into the 5 radical changes we suggest so that associations can address the challenges and how they are facing their associations today.
Now, was it something that, you guys had like a list of 10 or 12 and narrowed it down to these 6, or were these just kind of common recurring themes that had been uncovered through your work with associations?
These 6 really were across the board. And again, it didn't matter what industry or profession you were involved with, what your association represented, what members looked like. These are the 6 that are really challenging associations across the board. Now, it's true that some of them are challenging some associations more than others, but I'd be willing to bet that 90% of associations today are being affected by each of these. And again, some more than others, but they're being affected by these in some way, shape, or form. And so those 6 really rose to the top.
So with these 6, is that then when you guys developed the 5 strategies to tackle these? Did that come about kind of organically, or did you sit down and say, after analyzing all of this information, this is kind of what we've come up with and formulated?
The 5 radical changes really were practical ways that we could see, not necessarily easy, but practical ways we could see that the challenges could be addressed. And the 5 challenges or changes, if you're going to use them, we suggest that you actually do them first one first, second one second, because if the first one is in place, which is to really take a look at your governance structure and how it is and isn't helping what's happening within your association, if you have the right governance structure in place, everything else gets much easier. For some associations, governance change isn't going to happen and the hurdle is too high. And in that particular case, we say, go on to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th change. But best case scenario is you start from the beginning and you work through them methodically. And then when you're done, essentially you've got an association that's really tight and it's operating smoothly from a top-down basis.
Great. So this is a little bit of a tough question. After looking around at some reviews online and different blog posts, I found that some view your concepts in the book as more of an emergency stopgap measure that don't really get to the root of the problem. So what would you say, to comments like that?
They can be stopgap if they aren't followed up with strategies to help your association continue to work effectively. So really, it's more than just making some small changes or tinkering with what's really happening. If you take a look at how the market has changed and how technology has changed association delivery and how it communicates with its members, I think it's pretty easy to see that we're never going to go back to the days of yore. If you look 30 or 40 or 50 years ago and how associations communicated with their members, how they engaged their members, I think it's pretty safe to say that that has been forever changed by the internet, by the pace of competition, by new competitors coming into the market, by specialization, which is actually leading to the creation of new associations. So in some cases, an association had no competition. Now those same associations have two or three or four competitors that are after their same members. And when you realize that those changes aren't going to go away, you've got to take a long-term look at it. So we don't believe it's a stopgap measure. We believe it is changing the association from the top down so that it functions as effectively as it possibly could. But my caveat with that would be the changes need to be followed with some strategies, such as concentrating your resources, building on strengths, those type of strategies that'll make a difference in the long run for the association.
Well, as harsh as it may sound, do you feel that some associations should, essentially slowly wither away, die, as dramatic as that sounds, but really making a way for a new breed of association? Or do you think that there's hope to kind of salvage, what's happened over the last, let's say, 100 years that associations have been in existence?
Realistically, Brian, I think there are some associations today that will not be here in 10 years. And most of those associations are struggling with their value proposition. They can't articulate it, and because they can't articulate it, they're having difficulty sharing it with members and convincing members that they should join. So I don't really want to see it happen, but I believe that it's going to happen. The longer an association waits, especially a struggling association, the greater the chances are that they're not going to be here in 10 years. I've also seen some associations that were really headed in a downward spiral that have stopped that spiral because they've made some very methodical and deliberate and intentional decisions about what they need to do to regain their health and to regain their relevance within the market that they serve. So it's possible that some associations that are struggling today will be fine, but it's probable that some of the associations that are operating today won't be here in another decade.
Yeah, I got to be honest, as somebody who's a newcomer to the association industry, the first thing that I start seeing is, books with your title, Race for Relevance, and some of these messages of, struggle that associations are having. So I guess to kind of shift on more of a lighter note, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the real changes, or rather, have you seen real changes happening at associations as a result of some of the information that's been conveyed through the book?
We have, and it's been gratifying, and it's gratifying not because it shows that there is some relevance in the book. It's gratifying to me because these associations are staking a claim and they're saying this is who we want to be in the future and this is how we want to change. Some of those have been change in governance size and governance structure. We know of organizations that have decreased their House of Delegates by half, which is practically unheard of because it's tough to do.
Yeah.
We've seen some other organizations that have reduced the number of committees they have. We've seen some organizations reduce the number of meetings that they have. We've seen other organizations make a decision that their board meetings are no longer going to be a report back regarding what the association has accomplished since the last board meeting, but they've decided that they're going to have high-level strategy discussions and take a look at where the profession or industry is going and what they need to do to be different. I think another piece of this is that associations are giving themselves permission to do things differently than they have. I've seen some groups narrow their product offerings. I've seen some groups abandon products and services that were sacred cows. But because they had permission to do it, they started having the conversations that they really have probably needed to have for a while. They just didn't know how to start them, and they didn't know how to finish them. But they're having the conversations now that they need to have, and it's leading to change.
Now, have you encountered different people who've read the book or attended a session where you've presented the information that are kind of walk away scratching their head saying, this will never happen, or these are strategies that there's no hope for us to be able to make these types of changes. Do you encounter that? What's the response that you've seen from people?
There have been, it's kind of polarized. There have been some people that say, hey, great ideas, but that'll never happen in my association. And there have been some that have said, I felt like this for a long time and I just couldn't figure out why nobody was talking about it. And now we've got a tool and now we've got permission really to start having some of these conversations. So there are some people who are very hopeful about it. They're energized, they're enthusiastic, and they're taking really bold steps in asking their board to have some of these tough conversations. But I also see some that just feel like things are too entrenched. The culture is too strong. The history is too strong. They're concerned, one of the big issues, frankly, is representation and geographic representation specifically. They might have districts that all have to be represented at their board level, and they just don't know how they can change that so that members feel like they have representation. So part of the question really needs to be then, what do you mean when you talk about representation? What exactly does that mean? That I have a personal representative on the Board of Trustees, or is it enough for me to know that there's a mechanism that if I have a question or a problem or an issue that I'm struggling with, that I have a way to have a voice at the board meetings where I can come and be heard, or where I can Skype into the meeting, where I can join by conference call and know that my board's going to be responsive to some of my concerns. Now, granted, you don't want your board to be handling issues on a one-to-one basis, but the whole conversation of representation really has to take into consideration, what do we mean by the word representation? Another issue that comes up is the issue of engagement. If we shrink our number that's involved in governance, how do we get people engaged? And I'll tell you, I've been at board meetings, large board meetings, where there have been people who are at the board meeting, but they're sleeping, or they're reading the paper,
Wow.
or they're surfing the internet.
Yeah.
So they're there physically, but they're not engaged. So part of the question then becomes, what do we mean by the word engaged? I think what's going to happen for the association in the future, rather than having a few number of people who are engaged on a very high level with a huge time commitment, we're going to see a shift. And there will actually be more people participating in the governance and the work of the association, but they will not be making multi-year, huge time commitments. They will be making shorter commitments that might be an hour or two at a time, as opposed to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days out of the office to do association business.
Very interesting. Well, do you see that a lot of people have been, taking this information, and that it's almost kind of a slow step process to start pushing forward on some of this stuff? Or have you seen anybody, who's really kind of taken the bull by the horns and started shaking things up in their association? I mean, is that even a realistic expectation?
We've seen both. We've seen some groups that have just been primed for change. They didn't know how to communicate it and they didn't know how to do it, but once they had the tools, they were able to make it happen, and make it happen very quickly. And we've also seen other groups that are more cautious, a little bit more concerned, and they are taking multi-year steps to make change happen. And we also have some groups that are just kind of trying it out and seeing what they can get past, what they can get through. And then once they have a chance to start those conversations and hear the feedback, then they decide what they're going to do next. So some groups haven't said it's going to be all or nothing. They've said, we're going to take a couple of things that you've suggested. We're going to give it a try. We're going to see how it works in our organization, and then we'll decide what's next.
So I wanted to explore a little bit with you, like, what are the ways that you guys have been implementing these ideas with your clients? Are there any examples that you can provide of things that you've been working on currently or over the past 6 months or even longer?
There are organizations that have started having conversations at every board meeting. So rather than just doing the traditional board business where they have agenda items and they have motions placed on the table and they either vote those motions up and down, they're consolidating that business making it take less time so that they can have an open-ended discussion either at the beginning or the end of the board meeting. And the feedback that they're getting is really good because these conversations really are more interesting, frankly, and they're more relevant. And it makes their service to the association more interesting. So we've seen changes in how board business is being done. We have groups right now that are taking a look at reducing the number of products and services they offer. They've used the matrices in the book to decide what's most important. I've another group that I'm working with that traditionally has had very low attendance at their annual meeting, and the meeting has lost money for over a decade. They're aggressively taking a look and measuring every element of the meeting and asking what's most valuable and why. They're keeping those things. And the things that have low attendance or aren't as relevant, they're getting rid of. So pretty big, bold strokes. One group that did that that I know of, and I don't always get a report back, but in particular, I know there was a group in Texas that actually was able to change their annual session, and they showed a profit for the first time in a very, very long time. So really, I think what you're asking, Brian, is how is this affecting associations on a practical level? On a practical level, A, it's giving them permission, and B, it's giving them the tools they need to start having some of the conversations that we need to have. And the one thing I know for absolute sure is that change happens best through questions and conversations rather than being crammed down somebody's throat.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that it sounds like this has really opened up a discussion for a lot of associations to explore and ask questions. And I think that that's at least the first step. And it'll be interesting to see as the next 5 to 10 years marches on where that takes us.
One thing I'd add, though, I don't want to make it look like this is easy by any stretch of the imagination because it's not.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we've seen is that some associations start having the conversation and they realize that there's a lot of resistance. And rather than wasting time and energy pushing an idea that's not popular, they choose to wait. And maybe they don't have the conversation again for another year. But a year later, as the association's position worsens, maybe membership drops again, maybe their budget woes get greater. When the circumstances change, sometimes the conversation becomes more relevant. So some groups, if they aren't successful the first time around, they're waiting, and that wait time then positions them to start making some of the changes. And the other thing I would say is this isn't a magic potion in any stretch of the imagination. There are pieces of these ideas that are going to be applicable to some associations and not to others based on their structure. So we realize that the professionals working within the association and the volunteers running the associations have a very large role to play in adapting some of these ideas and deciding if they're even relevant for their particular group or not.
No, I'm glad to hear you say that. You know, it's not just hey, follow these steps in the book and your world will be perfect once you get it all mapped out and
Right.
address all the questions. You know, it's almost like turning the Titanic around, I think, in a sense. And, you know, it's at least good to see that these discussions are happening and, you know, starting people down the right path. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, I wanted to ask you, you know, have you seen any associations out there, at least that you've been exposed to, that are doing things dramatically, that have, you know, almost reinvented their organization? You know, is there anything like that you've seen?
We're seeing a lot of really exciting moves from associations, and here's the one thing they have in common. Even though they are nonprofits or not-for-profits, they are starting to operate using business practices. In other words, they're making a decision that they are no longer going to do things that lose money for the association, or they are no longer going to continue to host events that are either not well attended or are not meeting some minimum requirements that they set. So they're making some choices that are more business-like. And I'll give you an example of a really smart strategy from an association, but it's not typical of associations. One of my clients that I work with realized that moving training online was essential. They had high participation from members, and their members depended on them to do some um, training on behalf of their staff on behalf of the association. So they started taking a look at moving online, and as they were sitting around talking about it, they realized they had nobody on staff and nobody in volunteer leadership that really understood curriculum development for online deployment, really what it was going to take in terms of resources. So they started meeting with vendors. And the vendors gave them, they had great discussion with the vendors. The vendors helped them realize, frankly, that this is a lot more complicated than the vision they had was large enough that it was complicated, more complicated than the average association could take on. Now, in many cases, vendors are the great way to go, especially when you're looking at technology. I tell associations all the time, you don't know what you don't know. Go talk to some technology vendors and let them tell you what you need to know. In this particular case, however, they realized that the partnership was just going to be too big and too complicated, and there wasn't anybody on staff who could even manage the relationship with the vendor. So they went out and bought an online learning company and have since revamped all of their materials and are moving them online. So they essentially bought the expertise that they needed, and they made it part of the association. That's doing it like a business would do, a for-profit business, and that you don't find that very often when you look at the association market.
Great. So the last thing I wanted to end with is to have you talk a little bit about what's next on the horizon. Is there a follow-up book that's planned? Is there workshops or anything that you're doing to kind of push this message along and reach as many people as possible?
Harrison and I continue to meet with associations on a regular basis. We are helping them with strategy planning at their retreats as they look ahead as to what's next. We're doing a lot of leadership conferences where we're either working with volunteer leaders and or their chief staff executives. So we're continuing to promote the message. And again, the message isn't do everything that we say in the book. The message is simply start a conversation about what the future is going to look like and ask yourself what you need to do today to help you get there. What resources are necessary? What needs to be different in the future? The other piece of it is that we are doing a follow-up book called Road to Relevance, and we will be talking specifically about the strategies we believe that associations need to employ. And this circles back to the question that you asked earlier about race for relevance being a stopgap measure. It will be a stopgap measure if we don't make some decisions about the future and how we're going to concentrate our resources, build on strengths, those types of strategies that will keep the association profitable. And when I use the word profitable, I don't necessarily mean money-wise. I mean engagement-wise. I mean member-wise. I mean advocacy-wise. When we talk about profit, we don't think about it necessarily in dollars and cents.
Well, Mary, thank you for doing this interview, and thank you to everybody for watching. Be sure to sign up in the upper right corner of this website to be updated via email when new interviews are posted. Also, follow @BrianKellyNow on Twitter to stay on top of all things Association Maven related. Lastly, please submit your recommendation for which Association Maven you'd like to see interviewed next. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to bringing you more great interviews.